On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, which charted a bold course for the new nation of the United States and declared that all men are created equal. Many Americans have struggled to make that promise a reality. In the latter half of the 20th century, many groups, including women, Hispanics, Asians, Native Americans, and the physically challenged, fought for equal rights. But it was the African American civil rights movement that led the way. Less than 20 years after the end of the Civil War, freed blacks in the South were subjected to a series of laws that legally separated the races in order to maintain white supremacy. Known as Jim Crow laws, they established the doctrine of separate but equal and effectively created two separate and unequal societies, one for whites, the other for blacks. Buses, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, even drinking fountains were segregated by race. One of the most devastating of these segregation laws created separate schools for blacks and whites in many states. Inadequate funding and poor conditions made black public schools invariably inferior to white public schools.
The white schools were getting the benefits of the taxes of the community, and they were much better funded than black schools. Black schools lacked equipment, they lacked good fields, they lacked new textbooks, their teachers were paid less, the principals were paid less, and in general the facilities were a lot poorer than in white schools.
It wasn't until 1954 that the Supreme Court outlawed legal segregation in schools through the landmark Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka decision, which stated that separate could never be equal, and marked an important civil rights victory. Yet public areas remain segregated in many southern states. The Brown decision encouraged many African Americans in the South to challenge segregation laws in their own way. In 1955, a black woman named Rosa Parks was arrested after she refused to move to the black section in the back of a public bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This led to a massive boycott, as 17,000 blacks refused to ride the city buses. A year after the boycott began, a federal court struck down Alabama's law segregating public transportation. In January 1957, black ministers from across the South met in Atlanta, Georgia. Together they founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, and elected Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as president. A passionate and moving speaker, Dr. King would emerge as the leader of the early civil rights movement.
We're going to stand up right here in Alabama.
King committed the organization to gaining civil rights for African Americans through nonviolent protests and civil disobedience. Despite the Brown decision, many white Southerners had made it clear they would resist desegregation, and in 1957, President Dwight Eisenhower had to use federal troops to enforce a federal court order to desegregate the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Still, it was clear that the winds of change were beginning to blow across the South. Vowing to follow Dr. King's call for nonviolence, 4 African-American college freshmen sat down at a whites-only lunch counter on February 1, 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina. The students had staged one of the first sit-ins, a peaceful expression of their growing dissatisfaction with the slow pace of desegregation. The sit-in movement spread quickly to other southern cities, and most blacks remained committed to Dr. King's nonviolent tactics, even in the face of foul language, beatings, and arrests.
The police would use billy clubs and cattle prods, electric cattle prods that you would use on big animals to jab people. Not to respond to that, takes an awful lot of discipline, and it takes an awful lot of courage.
On May 4, 1961, a group of black and white protesters boarded 2 buses traveling from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans. Their goal was to integrate bus terminals on their ride through Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. They called themselves Freedom Riders. White mobs and members of the Ku Klux Klan slashed tires and firebombed the buses. Freedom Riders were beaten. Many were arrested. What happened to the first few Freedom Riders, however, only seemed to encourage more protesters. It grew into a multiracial force of 1,000 and gave the movement important publicity. This helped force the Kennedy administration to order the Interstate Commerce Commission to stop segregation in interstate bus travel. During the early 1960s, Birmingham, Alabama gained a reputation for extreme violence against blacks who organized for civil rights and tried to cross the color line. In April 1963, in jail after being arrested for leading an unauthorized protest march on the Birmingham City Hall, Dr. King wrote what became known as his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, saying, "For years I have heard the word wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with a piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. There comes a time when the cup of endurance runs over, and men are no longer willing to be plunged into the abyss of despair." The protests continued. Led by the SCLC, a group of children gathered in Birmingham on May 2, 1963, for a peaceful demonstration protesting segregation. Within 3 hours, close to 1,000 children were jailed. The next day, more children demonstrated. Police ordered firefighters to use hoses to disperse them and mobilized dog units to attack them. That night, national news programs broadcast footage of white officials brutalizing black children. The nation was shocked and horrified. A few weeks later, President Kennedy appeared on television announcing that he would send Congress the most sweeping civil rights bill since the end of the Civil War.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
To push Congress into taking action on the bill, a group of civil rights leaders called for a march on Washington. On August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people, black and white, from all over the country and from all walks of life, joined together in Washington to protest violence and discrimination in the South. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the closing remarks, an address that came to be called the I Have a Dream speech.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, with his civil rights bill still being debated in the House of Representatives. His death was a blow to the movement, but his successor, Lyndon Johnson, took up the cause and pressured the Congress to pass what became known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This measure outlawed racial discrimination in public accommodations and in the workplace, and tried to break down barriers to black voters in the Deep South.
I'm Idell Craft, and I'm working for the Board of Registration here in Greenwood.
The summer of 1964 became known as Mississippi Freedom Summer, as a diverse group of civil rights advocates tried to register black voters in Mississippi. Many whites in the state strongly resisted the effort. Some even resorted to violence, killing 3 young civil rights workers. In February 1965, a small voting rights march in Selma, Alabama, erupted in violence and ended in the death of a black activist. Outraged, civil rights advocates held another march on Sunday, March 7th. In an effort to stop the marchers, Governor George Wallace sent 200 state troopers armed with tear gas, nightsticks, and bullwhips. The violence was so severe that the event became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 weeks later, Martin Luther King Jr. organized another march from Selma to Montgomery. This time, though, President Johnson ordered National Guardsmen, Army troops, FBI agents, and U.S. Marshals to protect the marchers. At the end of the march, 25,000 people gathered on the steps of the Alabama state capitol to call for an end to voter discrimination. Later, in 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. The legislation was designed to fight the persistent discrimination in voting in southern states. Results came quickly. In 1964, only 23% of eligible African American voters were registered in the South. By 1969, the number had almost tripled to 61%. Even though segregation laws had ended and African Americans had won the right to vote throughout the South, economic and social discrimination against blacks continued. In contrast to the nonviolent tactics of Martin Luther King Jr., support began to build in parts of the black community for more forceful measures to promote change. Malcolm X, a Muslim minister and member of the Nation of Islam, came to be the most vocal spokesman for this movement. His slogan, "By any means necessary," illustrated how strongly he opposed Dr. King and his nonviolent approach to civil rights. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam also opposed the concept of racial integration.
Has integration solved the problem or made it worse? When you integrate a white community seeking better housing, history here during the past 10 years has proven that the whites cut out. They flee to the suburbs, and the community that you thought you were integrating soon becomes another all-black slum.
Malcolm X was assassinated by rival members of the Nation of Islam on February 21, 1965. But his ideas formed the basis for a new generation of black leaders who had become frustrated with the nonviolent tactics of Dr. King. One such group, started in Oakland, California, called themselves the Black Panthers.
The Black Panthers saw themselves as one of the many revolutionary parties in the United States that was willing to challenge the economic structure. Their style of presentation, with afros, with black berets, with black leather jackets, with their leadership in Oakland originally carrying weapons openly, certainly that image presented an image of danger to the American public.
The radicalism of the Black Panthers expressed the anger and frustration felt by many African Americans facing persistent discrimination in housing, education, and employment, particularly in urban areas. From 1965 to 1967, that frustration exploded in race riots across the country. Some of the most serious riots were in the Watts district of Los Angeles, Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan, where many people were killed and thousands injured. On April 4, 1968, a devastating blow was dealt to the civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a sniper outside his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee.
Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
Shock and outrage at King's murder sparked riots in more than 130 cities.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
A few months later, on June 5, 1968, presidential candidate and former Attorney General Robert Kennedy was murdered. His assassination came just after winning the California presidential primary with a campaign that pledged to bring the races together. The deaths of King and Kennedy in 1968 marked a dramatic loss of leadership for the civil rights movement. The African American struggle for justice, however, had lit a fire under other minorities who now began to push for their civil rights. In the 1960s, many Latinos living on the West Coast were farm workers. Many farm owners exploited these workers by routinely ignoring state laws regarding working standards. In 1962, led by the dynamic Cesar Chavez, the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, was formed to try and improve working conditions. Like Dr. King, Chavez employed nonviolent tactics to achieve his goals. In 1965, the NFWA, later to become the United Farm Workers, began a strike against grape growers in California. Chavez and the NFWA also organized a successful consumer boycott of grapes that were not picked by unionized labor. By 1970, most grape growers had agreed to contracts with the farm workers. Later, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill, the 1975 Agricultural Labor Relations Act, that established collective bargaining laws for farm workers. While the battle for civil rights has been fought by many groups of people, it is ironic that those native to America have been consistently denied opportunity here. In 1968, inspired by militant black groups, young Native Americans formed the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which called for political action and cultural pride. In 1969, members of AIM seized Alcatraz Island, an unoccupied former federal penitentiary in San Francisco Bay, holding it for 19 months to publicize the plight of Native Americans. In an effort to call attention to what they considered centuries of betrayal and deceit, AIM led the Trail of Broken Treaties March on Washington in 1972. They demanded proper health care, housing, employment, economic development, and education for all Indian people. In 1973, armed members of AIM and other Native Americans occupied the town of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation of South Dakota, site of an infamous massacre of Indians by federal troops in 1890. The intent was to publicize the terrible conditions in which the Sioux people lived. But events got out of control when the armed protesters clashed with FBI agents during the 71-day siege, and 2 AIM members were killed. The militant pressure did result in some minor change. The government returned 48,000 acres of sacred lands to the Taos Pueblo of New Mexico. The Nixon administration targeted minority aid programs for Native Americans living in cities, and Congress added money in the Indian Education Act of 1972. Asian Americans also pushed for federal help in overcoming problems related to inadequate health care and overcoming language barriers, as well as economic reforms, equal pay for equal work. When Hawaii became a state in 1959, Asian Americans were ensured greater political representation in the U.S. Congress. Since the late 40s, many Japanese Americans had sought justice for being forced by the U.S. government to live in internment camps during World War II. Although the government paid some monies under the Japanese American Evacuation Claims Act of 1948, it was not until 1988 that the United States government formally apologized and provided more substantial payments as compensation to the displaced Japanese Americans. Issues of equality were not limited to race and ethnicity. The movement for civil rights also had a major impact on women. Women joined the industrial workforce in great numbers during World War II, enjoying a new measure of economic independence and job satisfaction. But many left the workforce at the war's end as returning soldiers reclaimed their factory jobs. In 1963, Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, pointed out the plight of the so-called housewife, verbalizing the dissatisfaction of many women. Passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, however, would help change that. Title VII of that law prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. By forbidding discrimination by gender, Title VII would become one of the cornerstones of the women's movement. In 1966, Friedan and 27 other women founded NOW, the National Organization for Women, to help achieve their goals. NOW's aim was to take action, to bring about equality for all women. Equal job opportunities, along with equal pay, were at the top of their list. NOW pointed out that for every dollar a man made, a woman made 59 cents for the same job. NOW also focused on the value of women's work inside the home. They popularized the slogan, "Every mother is a working mother." Using Title VII as leverage, women began entering the labor force in swelling numbers at nearly every level of employment. Women also began earning college degrees in rapidly increasing numbers.
Nowadays, the entering classes of law school classes are about 50% women. And in medical schools, the entering classes at least, are 30 to 40% women. This is a big change from the 1960s in terms of the opportunities available to women.
NOW and other women's groups also work to secure reproductive freedom by calling for the repeal of existing anti-abortion laws. In 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that such laws were unconstitutional in Roe v. Wade. This landmark decision severely limited state abortion laws and effectively legalized abortion in the U.S. Many women participated in a campaign for an equal rights amendment to the Constitution, which stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex. The ERA made it through Congress, but did not get the required approval from 3/4 of the state legislatures to become an amendment. Sex discrimination was not only a women's issue. Homosexuals protested discrimination based on sexual orientation, demanding the same legal protections as heterosexuals. Although many activists have been effective in the fight to end discriminatory practices, gay rights remain a divisive social and political issue. Like other groups, rights for the disabled have often been overlooked. Even today, people with disabilities continue to press for equal opportunities to participate fully in American society. The 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act represented the single most sweeping civil rights legislation since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The bill banned discrimination in the hiring, promoting, and firing of persons with disabilities. In the space of 40 years, the civil rights movement made important gains. Legal segregation came to an end. Discriminatory practices in housing and the workplace were outlawed, and the concept of equal rights began to expand beyond groups defined by race. In 1965, the federal government, in an attempt to make up for past discrimination, introduced affirmative action. The policy encouraged the inclusion of minorities in hiring, college admissions, and the awarding of government contracts. Affirmative action helped diversify jobs, unions, police and fire departments, and college campuses across the country. Nevertheless, many groups continue to strive for equality in America.
It's fashionable to say, well, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and we really haven't made as much progress as we needed to make. Absolutely right. This country is not yet equal, but an enormous change has occurred.
The people are diverse, but the goal is the same, to create one out of many, one body of individuals with equal protection under the law. As a result of the civil rights movements during the latter half of the 20th century, America has moved closer to the pledge of one nation with liberty and justice for all.